I'm not a murderer. I am a survivor. These are the actual words Sarah Boone wrote in a 28-page handwritten letter from prison. After being convicted of zipping her boyfriend into a suitcase and leaving him to suffocate to death. But here's what makes this case absolutely unbelievable. She recorded the entire thing on her phone. She filmed Jorge Torres begging for his life, gasping, "I can't breathe," over and over again. She taunted him. She laughed. And then she went to bed. The next morning Jorge Torres was dead. And yet, Sarah Boone still claims she's innocent. Her prison letters reveal a mind that refuses to accept reality, a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that even seasoned criminal psychologists are stunned by what she wrote. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through every shocking detail of this case. The bizarre relationship. The night of the murder. The videos that sealed her fate. The circus of 8 different attorneys. The trial that captivated the nation. And finally, those prison letters that reveal the truly shocking truth about Sarah Boone's mind. This is the complete story. And I promise you, it's more disturbing than you can imagine. Who were Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres? Before we get to that horrific night in February 2020, you need to understand the toxic relationship that led to Jorge Torres' death. Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. lived in Winter Park, Florida, a quiet suburb of Orlando. On the surface they seemed like any other couple. But behind closed doors, their relationship was a nightmare of violence, alcohol, and chaos. The cycle of violence. Jorge Torres was arrested 4 times for alleged battery against Sarah Boone. 4 separate incidents where police were called, where charges were filed, where the violence was documented. But here's where it gets complicated. Sarah was also arrested once, in July 2018, for battery by strangulation against Jorge. That charge was eventually dismissed, but it shows this wasn't a one-sided situation. Neighbors reported hearing them fight constantly. Police visits were so frequent that officers knew the address by heart. At one point, there was a temporary injunction for protection in place because the violence had escalated so severely, but also volatile and controlling. What's important here is that both Sarah and Jorge were trapped in what domestic violence experts call a cycle of abuse. A pattern where violence is followed by reconciliation, followed by tension building, followed by more violence. But on February 23, 2020, that cycle ended in the most horrific way possible. February 23, 2020. Sarah Boone claims she and Jorge Torres played hide and seek while drunk. She says Jorge willingly climbed into a blue suitcase, she zipped it up, then forgot about him and went to sleep. February 24, 1 p.m. Sarah calls 911, claiming she just woke up and found Jorge unresponsive in the suitcase. He'd been trapped for 11 hours and died from asphyxiation. The game changer. Police find 2 videos on Sarah's phone showing Jorge desperately begging, "I can't breathe," with his fingers pushing through the zipper. Sarah taunting him, "That's what you get. That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." Sarah telling him to shut the fuck up, while he pleads for his life. Sarah laughing at his suffering in the second video. The arrest. Same day, Sarah is charged with second-degree murder. Her story immediately shifts from innocent game to "I was an abuse victim defending myself." The legal circus begins. What happened over the next 4 years is one of the most bizarre legal sagas in recent true crime history. Sarah Boone didn't just go through one attorney, or 2, or even 3. She went through 8 different court-appointed attorneys. Let me walk you through this absolute circus, because it reveals something crucial about Sarah Boone's personality, something that would become even more apparent in those prison letters. Attorney #1-#3, the early dismissals, 2020 to 2021. The first few attorneys were dismissed relatively quickly. Court records show irreconcilable differences and breakdown in attorney-client relationship. But what does that actually mean? Well, one attorney reported that Sarah Boone was calling him 5 to 10 times per day. She would insult him, question his strategy, demand he do things her way. Another attorney withdrew because of a conflict of interest. He had previously represented Jorge Torres in an unrelated matter. That's actually a legitimate reason for withdrawal. But the pattern was already emerging. Sarah Boone was impossible to work with. Attorney #4-#6, the escalation, 2021 to 2023. As the case dragged on, the attorney dismissals became more frequent and more contentious. Sarah wrote a 58-page letter to the judge detailing her complaints about her attorneys. 58 pages. She accused them of not listening to her, not understanding her defense, not fighting hard enough for her innocence. Keep in mind, these were experienced public defenders. They knew what they were doing. But Sarah Boone was convinced she knew better. One attorney withdrew citing hardship. He was no longer practicing appellate work and couldn't continue the representation. But even this withdrawal was complicated by Sarah's demands and complaints. The judge's ultimatum, 2023 to 2024. By 2023, Judge Michael Kranick had had enough. He made a ruling that would prove crucial. Sarah Boone had forfeited her right to court-appointed counsel. The judge essentially said, "You've gone through enough attorneys. We're not doing this anymore. Either work with the attorney you have or represent yourself." This was an extraordinary step, but the judge was trying to prevent further delays. The case was already 4 years old. Jorge Torres' family deserved justice. The trial needed to happen. Attorney #7-8, the final attempts 2024. Even after the judge's ultimatum, there were 2 more attorney changes. The dysfunction continued right up until the trial. Finally, in October 2024, the judge set a firm trial date and made it clear. No more attorney changes would be permitted. The trial was happening with or without Sarah Boone's cooperation. Why does this matter? This isn't just a quirky detail about a difficult defendant. This pattern of behavior, the inability to work with anyone, the constant blame of others, the refusal to accept professional advice. This tells us something crucial about Sarah Boone's psychology. She couldn't accept that she was wrong. She couldn't accept that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She couldn't accept that her attorneys were trying to help her. And as we'll see when we get to those prison letters, this pattern would continue even after her conviction. The battered spouse defense. Now, let's talk about Sarah Boone's defense strategy, because this is where things get really complicated. Sarah's attorneys decided to pursue a battered spouse syndrome defense. The argument was that Sarah had endured years of abuse from Jorge Torres, and that her actions on the night of February 23 were somehow influenced by that trauma. What is battered spouse syndrome? Battered spouse syndrome, also called battered woman syndrome (BWS), is a psychological condition that can develop in people who experience prolonged domestic abuse. The theory, developed by psychologist Dr. Lenore Walker in the 1970s, suggests that victims of chronic abuse can develop learned helplessness, PTSD-like symptoms, and altered threat perception. In legal contexts, BWS has been used to explain why abuse victims sometimes kill their abusers, often arguing that they genuinely believed they were in imminent danger, even if that wasn't objectively true. The defense's expert, Dr. Julie Harper. Sarah Boone's defense team brought in Dr. Julie Harper, a psychologist who evaluated Sarah and testified that she suffered from battered woman syndrome and PTSD due to intimate partner violence with Jorge Torres. Dr. Harper's testimony was meant to provide context. Sarah wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was a traumatized woman who had endured years of abuse and whose actions that night were influenced by that trauma. The prosecution's counterargument. But here's where the defense fell apart. Even if Sarah had been abused, and there was evidence of mutual violence in the relationship, how does that explain what happened that night? Prosecutor William J. made this point devastatingly clear during the trial. Jorge Torres was zipped inside a suitcase. He was completely helpless. He was begging for his life. He posed zero threat to Sarah Boone in that moment. This wasn't a case of a battered woman fighting back against an imminent attack. This wasn't self-defense. This was torture. And those videos? They didn't show a terrified abuse victim acting in fear. They showed someone who was enjoying her power over a helpless person. The problem with the defense. Battered spouse syndrome defenses typically work in cases where the victim killed their abuser during an active assault. The victim genuinely believed they were in imminent danger. The victim's actions were proportional to the perceived threat. But Sarah Boone's case had none of those elements. Jorge was trapped in a suitcase. He couldn't hurt her. He was begging for mercy. And Sarah's response wasn't fear, it was mockery and cruelty. Even more damning, after recording those videos, Sarah didn't call 911. She didn't try to get help. She didn't panic. She went to bed. The mutual violence issue. The prosecution also pointed out that this wasn't a clear-cut case of one-sided abuse. Court records showed Jorge had been arrested 4 times for battery against Sarah. Sarah had been arrested once for battery by strangulation against Jorge. Multiple witnesses testified to mutual violence in the relationship. Both had restraining orders against each other at various times. This complicated the battered spouse narrative. If both parties were violent toward each other, could Sarah really claim she was solely a victim? Expert testimony battles. The prosecution brought in their own expert to rebut Dr. Harper's testimony. They argued that even if Sarah had experienced abuse, It didn't excuse or explain her actions that night. The expert pointed out that Sarah had options. She could have left the relationship, she could have called police, as she had done before, she could have sought help from domestic violence resources, she could have simply unzipped the suitcase. Instead, she chose to record Jorge's suffering, taunt him, and leave him to die. The jury's perspective. Ultimately, the jury would have to decide. Was Sarah Boone a battered woman who snapped after years of abuse? Or was she a vindictive killer who used past abuse as an excuse for murder? The videos would prove to be the deciding factor. The sentencing hearing. On December 2, 2024, Sarah Boone appeared in court for her sentencing hearing. This was the moment when Jorge Torres' family could finally address the woman who killed their loved one. And this was the moment when Sarah Boone could show remorse, accept responsibility, and perhaps receive some measure of leniency from the judge. She did none of those things. Victim impact statements. Jorge's family members delivered powerful victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. His mother, Blanca Torres, spoke directly to Sarah Boone. "You took my son from me in the most horrible way imaginable. He begged you for help and you laughed at him. You are a monster." His sister Victoria said, "Jorge wasn't perfect. He had his struggles. But he didn't deserve to die like that. No one deserves to die like that. You could have saved him, but you chose not to. You chose to let him suffer." They talked about Jorge's daughter growing up without her father. They talked about the hole his death left in their family. They talked about the nightmares they have, imagining his final hours. Sarah Boone's statement. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, everyone expected, or at least hoped, that she would finally show some remorse. She didn't. Instead, Sarah Boone gave a rambling statement that focused almost entirely on herself. She talked about the abuse she had endured. She talked about how unfair the trial had been. She talked about how she was the real victim. She made vague references to what really happened that night, without ever taking responsibility for Jorge's death. At one point she said, "I'm not the monster they're making me out to be. I'm a survivor." There was no apology to Jorge's family. No acknowledgement of his suffering. No acceptance of what she had done. Judge Kranick's response. Judge Michael Kranick had presided over this case for 4 years. He had dealt with the attorney changes, the delays, the legal maneuvering. He had watched the videos. He had heard all the evidence. And now he had to decide Sarah Boone's fate. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Kranick was blunt. "Ms. Boone, you had every opportunity to save Jorge Torres' life. You chose not to. The videos show clearly that you were aware of his distress and instead of helping him, you mocked him. This was a cruel and heinous act." He noted that while he had considered the history of domestic violence in the relationship, it did not excuse or justify what Sarah did that night. Jorge Torres was helpless. He was trapped. He was begging for his life. And you left him to die. The sentence. Judge Kranick sentenced Sarah Boone to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This was the maximum sentence for second-degree murder in Florida. The judge clearly felt that Sarah's actions warranted the harshest possible punishment. Sarah showed no emotion as the sentence was handed down. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and that should have been the end of the story. But Sarah Boone wasn't done yet. The prison letters. After her sentencing, Sarah Boone was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, one of the largest women's prisons in the United States. And that's when she started writing letters. The 28-page letter to Judge Kranick. The most shocking of these letters was a 28-page handwritten missive that Sarah sent to Judge Michael Kranick, the same judge who had just sentenced her to life in prison. In this letter, Sarah revealed something truly disturbing. She still doesn't believe she did anything wrong. Let me read you some excerpts from this letter, because they reveal the shocking truth about Sarah Boone's mindset. "I'm not a murderer. I am a survivor. What happened that night was the result of years of abuse that no one seems to want to acknowledge." She goes on to attack Judge Kranick directly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, you showed clear bias against me throughout this trial. You refused to acknowledge the abuse I suffered. You allowed the prosecution to paint me as a monster when I was fighting for my life." She continues, "The jury never heard the full story. My attorneys failed me. The system failed me. And now I'm paying the price for defending myself against an abuser." What these letters reveal. These letters are psychologically fascinating and deeply disturbing. They show several key patterns. 1. Complete lack of accountability. Sarah never once acknowledges that Jorge Torres died because of her actions. She never expresses remorse for his suffering. She never apologizes to his family. Instead, she frames herself as the victim in every scenario. Victim of abuse, victim of a biased judge, victim of incompetent attorneys, victim of an unfair system. 2. Narcissistic tendencies. Psychologists who have reviewed these letters without directly examining Sarah note patterns consistent with narcissistic personality traits. Inability to accept criticism or false grandiose sense of self-importance, belief that rules don't apply to them, tendency to blame others for their problems, lack of empathy for others' suffering. 3. Distorted reality. Perhaps most disturbing is that Sarah seems to genuinely believe her own narrative. This isn't just someone making excuses. This is someone who has constructed an alternate reality where she is blameless. She watched Jorge Torres beg for his life. She recorded it. She mocked him. She left him to die. And yet, in her mind, she's the victim. Additional letters. Sarah didn't stop with the letter to Judge Kranick. She also wrote to media outlets, trying to get journalists to tell her side of the story and expose the injustice of her conviction. Advocacy groups, reaching out to domestic violence organizations, claiming she's a battered woman who was wrongly convicted for defending herself. Legal organizations, asking for help with appeals, claiming her trial was fundamentally unfair. In every letter, the theme is the same. Sarah Boone is innocent. Sarah Boone is a victim. Sarah Boone deserves justice. The psychological explanation. Criminal psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who has studied similar cases, explains that some convicted killers develop what she calls narrative immunity. They construct a story about themselves that makes them the hero or victim, and they become psychologically immune to any evidence that contradicts that narrative. For Sarah Boone, the narrative is, I was an abused woman who was pushed too far, and the system punished me for surviving. The actual evidence, the videos, the timeline, Jorge's desperate pleas, doesn't fit this narrative. So in Sarah's mind, it must be wrong. The videos must be out of context. The jury must have been biased. The judge must have been unfair. This isn't just denial. This is a complete reconstruction of reality. The impact on Jorge's family. For Jorge Torres' family, these letters have been devastating. His sister Victoria told reporters, she still doesn't get it. My brother is dead. He died in the most horrible way possible. And she's writing letters about how unfair her trial was? It's sickening. His mother Blanca said, I pray every day that she will finally feel remorse. That she will finally understand what she did. But these letters, they show she never will. The legal reality. Despite Sarah's claims in her letters, legal experts say her chances of a successful appeal are extremely slim. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The trial was conducted properly. Her multiple attorneys all tried to defend her to the best of their abilities. The videos alone make this case virtually appeal-proof. There's no way to explain away Jorge Torres begging for his life while Sarah mocks him. Sarah Boone will likely spend the rest of her life in prison. And based on these letters, she will likely spend that entire time believing she's innocent. The psychology of denial. Now that we've covered the facts of the case and Sarah's shocking prison letters, I want to dive deeper into the psychology behind her behavior. Because understanding why someone like Sarah Boone can commit such a horrific act and then deny all responsibility is crucial to understanding this case. Cognitive dissonance theory. Psychologist Leon Festinger developed the theory of cognitive dissonance in the 1950s. The basic idea is that humans experience psychological discomfort when they hold two contradictory beliefs or when their actions contradict their self-image. For most people, this discomfort leads to change. We either change our behavior or change our beliefs to reduce the contradiction. But for some people, especially those with certain personality disorders, the resolution is different. They simply deny reality. Sarah Boone likely sees herself as a good person, a victim, a survivor. But her actions that night, recording Jorge's suffering, mocking him, leaving him to die, contradict that self-image. So rather than accept that she did something monstrous, she reconstructs reality. It wasn't her fault. He deserved it. She was defending herself. The system is wrong. The role of domestic violence. Here's where things get complicated. There was violence in Sarah and Jorge's relationship. That's documented. That's real. And it's entirely possible that Sarah experienced genuine trauma from that violence. But here's what's crucial to understand. Being a victim of abuse does not give someone the right to torture and kill another person. Many abuse survivors leave their relationships without harming anyone. Many seek help, get therapy, and rebuild their lives. The vast majority of domestic violence victims never become killers. Sarah Boone had options. She had called police before. She had restraining orders. She could have left. Instead, she chose to trap Jorge in a suitcase and watch him suffocate. Empathy deficits. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is Sarah's apparent lack of empathy for Jorge's suffering. When Jorge was begging, "I can't breathe," Sarah's response wasn't concern or fear, it was mockery and satisfaction. This suggests a profound empathy deficit. Either Sarah couldn't understand Jorge's suffering, or she could understand it but didn't care. Research on empathy deficits shows they're often associated with narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, history of trauma, which can sometimes impair empathy development, substance abuse, which was present in this case. The missing reasons phenomenon. There's a concept in psychology called the missing reasons. It refers to people who claim others have cut them off or turned against them for no reason, when in reality, they've been told the reasons repeatedly but refuse to acknowledge them. Sarah Boone exhibits this pattern. She claims her attorneys failed her for no reason, the judge was biased for no reason, the jury convicted her despite no real evidence. But the reasons are there. They're documented. They're on video. She just refuses to see them. Can people like Sarah change? This is the question many people ask. Is there any hope that Sarah Boone will eventually accept responsibility for what she did? The honest answer is, probably not. Research on personality disorders and criminal behavior shows that people who exhibit this level of denial and lack of empathy rarely change, especially as they age. Sarah is now in her mid-40s. Her personality patterns are deeply ingrained. She spent 4 years constructing and reinforcing her victim narrative. Without intensive psychological intervention, which she would have to voluntarily seek and engage with, she will likely maintain her current beliefs for the rest of her life. The danger of the victim narrative. One of the most troubling aspects of Sarah's letters is how she weaponizes the language of victimhood. She uses terms like survivor, abuse victim, and self-defense, legitimate terms that describe real experiences of real victims, to excuse inexcusable behavior. This is dangerous because it can undermine public understanding of domestic violence. Real victims might fear coming forward because they worry they'll be compared to Sarah Boone. It's crucial to understand, Sarah Boone is not representative of domestic violence survivors. The vast majority of abuse survivors never harm anyone. They're genuinely trying to escape dangerous situations. Sarah Boone used past abuse as a shield to justify murder. That's not survival, that's manipulation. Conclusion: the shocking truth. So what is the shocking truth that Sarah Boone's prison letters reveal? It's not that she's innocent. The evidence proves she's not. It's not that she was justified. Nothing could justify what she did. The shocking truth is this: Sarah Boone genuinely believes her own lies. She has constructed a reality where she is the victim, where Jorge deserved what happened, where the entire justice system conspired against her. And she will likely believe this for the rest of her life. That's the truly disturbing part of this case. Not just that someone could do something so horrific, but that they could do it and never feel remorse. Never accept responsibility. Never acknowledge the humanity of their victim. Sarah Boone's letters don't reveal hidden evidence or secret conspiracies. They reveal something far more unsettling: a mind that has completely disconnected from reality. Jorge Torres spent his final hours trapped in darkness, gasping for air, begging for mercy from someone who had none to give. And the woman who killed him still thinks she's the victim. That's the shocking truth. And it's more disturbing than any conspiracy theory or hidden evidence could ever be. This case will haunt everyone who learns about it. The videos, the cruelty, the complete lack of remorse. But perhaps the most haunting aspect is this. Somewhere in a Florida prison, Sarah Boone is probably writing another letter right now, still convinced that she's the victim, still believing that the world has wronged her. And Jorge Torres remains dead, a man who died one of the most terrifying deaths imaginable, at the hands of someone who claimed to love him. Remember his name. Remember his humanity. And remember that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life was cut short. Rest in peace, Jorge Torres Jr.